Okay, well, hello everybody. Thank you so much, Amelia, for the wonderful introduction and for the beautiful tile and also for the invitation to be here in Malaga. Already some really interesting and provocative discussions, and I hope more of that over the rest of today and into tomorrow. So the presentation, the title of the presentation I'm going to give today is about two things that I think about a lot, I guess, design and the future. And I want to actually start with a story. The story starts in 1939 in New York City. This was a year in which New York City was hosting the World's Fair. And like World's Fairs before and after it, this was a massive international event, people coming from all over the world, millions of people coming to this expression, this celebration of ingenuity, creativity, thinking a lot about how technology might change the way that people live their everyday lives. And I think one of the reasons that I find this event interesting has to do with just the timing of this. 1939, there was a civil war in this country. All of Europe was on the brink of war. The United States was still in the throes of the Great Depression, big economic downturn. And so it's in the midst of this, multiple crises that in some ways I think it's an event that's trying to look forward towards something positive and something optimistic. And probably the most hyped event or hyped experience to be had at this World's Fair was the Futurama exhibition. Maybe some of you know this story a little bit, but what happens, what the Futurama exhibit was explained as or described as was a vision of the future, also described as a look at the city of tomorrow, and it was proposing to look at what the city of tomorrow in America might look like 20 years into the future, so from 1939 looking towards 1959, 1960. It was so hyped, I guess you would say, that if you were to visit Futurama, you would leave with this badge. I have seen the future. Wow, right? Really powerful stuff. You have been transported. And so what happened? Like, what actually happens when you go to visit the future? Well, this particular future was designed by the already well-established, well-known industrial designer from the United States, Norman Bel Geddes. Bel Geddes was already well-known as a designer of lots of everyday sort of industrial products, radios, and home utensils and things like this. He had also worked on some more conceptual projects like concept cars that never came to be, massive airliners and things like this. But this project, I think, is of a different magnitude. It was not only to kind of reimagine, or not only to design a city, but sort of reimagine living in a city of the future, and also how that city might connect to other aspects of the American geography and landscape. And so the exhibition itself was staged as some combination of like a massive scale model, but also like an amusement park ride. So visitors were actually suspended and sort of gliding over this model that was 1 acre in size, or I guess about half hectare in size. It was showing possible urban scenarios, rural scenarios, basically every kind of landscape you can imagine in the U.S., from cities to deserts to lakes and mountains, coast to coast. And really the biggest difference the biggest change from what was existing in American cities at the time and what was here was the new invention of the freeway, which had been determined by engineers. It would be possible for cars to move very fast as long as they're moving in the same direction, and the on-ramps and the off-ramps are designed in a very particular way. And what Bel Geddes was able to do, I think, with the exhibition was to demonstrate that this seemingly simple technical innovation would have some pretty far-flung implications for how people could live, that you would maybe work in one of these big towers in Manhattan and then go live in the countryside commuting at night. And so I think it's worth pointing, the entire thing was sponsored by General Motors. So the entire project was about trying to build a certain kind of public support, a public enthusiasm for this new life built around the freeway, built around the automobile. It was based on a previous project that Bel Geddes had worked on that was sponsored by the Shell Oil Company, called also the City of Tomorrow. So yeah, it's not very hard to see how the sponsors were really well invested in this version of the future that Bel Geddes was crafting and attempting to build public support for. In this particular story, we got the freeways, and it actually happened, of course, in the years after World War II, pretty much on time with the 20-year forecast of Bel Geddes for a variety of reasons for, people to be able to move about, for goods to move about. Also some military planning was some of the rationale for the U.S. highway system, but in the years and decades after World War II, it came to be. Of course, there were some downsides, and some of them are maybe the obvious ones. I mean, we have all the issues of massive amounts of congestion and traffic and the pollution, the noise, but we also have, in some ways, the long-term effects of what it meant for American cities to build themselves almost entirely around the automobile. That city planning requires an allocation of space for parking and parking garages, a fossil fuel infrastructure, and all of these kinds of things. And I think what's also interesting is that this sort of top-down view of thinking about life in the city, about sort of designing, from this kind of bird's eye, God's eye view, also immediately met backlash of people who lived in some of these places. And so as the freeway system was expanding, it was required to demolish neighborhoods, cut through communities. Some resistance came in places like the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where Jane Jacobs was kind of became known as a grassroots community organizer, sort of resisting the development of the freeway, in this case successfully diverting the freeway away from this particular neighborhood, and has also has its own legacy, I think, of a version of a more kind of participatory approach to urban planning that doesn't only rely on the experts with sort of the top-down view, but the lived experiences and expertise of the people living in those cities. Okay, so why am I telling this story? I'm telling this story in part because we're not quite 100 years away from the story, but I think we find ourselves in a similar moment in some ways, or at least some parallels I see in the way that the images of the future are being sort of crafted and consumed around us. And so if we think about things that are circulating as kind of mainstream cultural imaginaries about the future to come 10 or 20 years from now, I think one of the lessons we could take away is just to pay attention to who's sponsoring those images, who's crafting those images, how do we consume those images, and to wonder about some space between them blurs often. And this is what they're about. They are making some kind of transformation, some kind of transition at some kind of scale. But I think that we also can learn a lesson from this particular example, that the technological change alone, without some other kind of social, cultural, economic, political change, is going to be inherently conservative. And by conservative, I mean maintaining, in particular, the kinds of power structures that have existed. And we can see that really clearly in what happened with, effectively. In the imagining, the shaping, the sort of making of images of different kinds of futures, and can help, not independently, but can help in the catalyzing of action towards them. But one of the issues that I think this lesson makes really clear is that many professional design practices have been largely instrumentalized by the paradigm of a capitalist society, that the demands of the sponsors in this case actually have more to do with the nature of the vision of the future and also the action built towards it than the designers themselves. So I wonder, and these are the questions that I'm asking myself, and I guess I'll put in front of all of you at this conference, what kinds of designing can help us to shape these different images of the future? And by different, I mean those that are not necessarily, manufactured by existing, powerful interests and entities, organizations, individuals, et cetera, but also can conflict or offer different possibilities than those that are being manufactured for us. But also what kinds of designing can shift this paradigm, can actually make some kind of change in our understanding of what, in this case, design of certain kinds is actually for, what it is to do. So these are just some of the things I'm talking about in this book, as Amelia pointed out, and I think some questions that certainly are not resolved in the book, but these are some of the big topics that it's trying to take up. One of the really, I think, important reference points for me in putting this book together is the work of the British design historian John Heskett. Not sure how many people are familiar with his work, but for me, a really important point of reference is his book, Design and the Creation of Value. I think what Heskett did with this work was basically like a lot of heavy lifting for design scholars and practitioners of all kinds. Heskett was looking, kind of mining the history of, I would qualify like mainstream Western economic theory, and in all of these different models, looking for those moments where you could say, that is where something like design can generate value. There's somewhere inside this theory that a design practice of a certain kind can generate value within this theory. And what he found, maybe not surprisingly also to designers or design researchers, is there was precious little that he could find inside these existing economic theories that would say, yes, that's where design creates value in Marx's labor theory of value, or in some of these other examples. And so, again, I think it's significant that the work that he put into sort of developing this and comparing it to design practices. I think he starts. Where is that value coming from? So finding very little in existing theories, Heskett went about creating his own, what he called the value creation theory. And again, I think it's wonderful because it is perhaps the most robust and sort of comprehensive analysis of value creation for design. And what he lands upon here are these three distinct types of innovation that design practices can contribute to. He names them process innovations, so how things are produced, how things are circulated, how things are distributed, things like this. Product innovations, so the actual goods and services, what they are, how they operate, et cetera. And then transaction innovations, how exchanges are actually made. And so again, while I find a lot of value and sort of applaud the model here, what Heskett indicates they all point back towards is imperfect competition. And so I find it's also now still fully trapped within a particular paradigm which says this is what value is imperfect competition within a competitive marketplace. And so I imagine I'm probably not alone to sort of question this as the ceiling of the kind of value that design can create. And I should mention this is work that Heskett was working on for some time prior to his death. The book was published posthumously, but I would venture to guess that many people in this room are observing or researching or participating in models of design practices in UX or in service design or in social innovation that would argue that this ceiling of imperfect competition as the ultimate function of design's value making is questionable. Okay, but like, so what, right? Who cares? Like, what is actually the problem here? Well, of course, capitalism has been critiqued since it began, hundreds of years, libraries full of criticisms, lots of very positive things said as well. Not so interested in jumping into all of that, but more concerned about where are we right now? What's happening, today? What is the potential historical transition that we are living through? And so, if we take, for instance, this situation in which I would say many of the professional fields of what we call modern design were born into a particular model of industrial capitalism, had a lot to do with mass production, mass consumption of goods. Those practices, those professional practices have evolved alongside the history of capitalism, have been intimately connected to it. But we also get to the moment today where capitalism itself is facing multiple internal crises. And I'm not just talking, so not here talking about other crises that might be happening outside, things related to climate or social inequities or other kinds of conflicts, but inside capitalism, two of the major crises have to do with diminishing productivity, something that's very important for a system that's predicated on infinite growth, but also a crisis of legitimacy. And so on the productivity side, we have, of course, all kinds of new technologies which are really reshaping and kind of upending some of the basic logics that this system depends upon. So, what is property is having to be redefined in order to protect certain aspects of the system. The production costs of things that have zero marginal costs for production. And also the value propositions of what they can offer. And I just want to be clear that this is, in part has to do with what these technologies make possible, but they're also connected to new social practices as well, of how people share and distribute information. And those things also have some impact on material production and material things as well. So I think this is part of the historical transition. The legitimacy piece is probably what actually drew me to the subject in the first place. And we were talking at dinner last night about how this sort of started. As somebody who grew up in the United States, I have to say that I didn't spend a whole lot of time questioning capitalism, even when I heard lots of criticisms around it. But it happened in the year 2016 that was the first time I noticed a poll of young people in the United States. 2016 was a very wild political time in the United States, and something like 51% of young Americans were claiming that they had completely lost confidence in this system. And this poll has been repeated multiple times in the US and UK, and we only see those numbers going up. And what this means to me is that we have actually generation or generations who are actively seeking a redefined political economy, actively seeking alternatives, and yet have no coherent vision for it. So in those same polls, socialism does very badly. So it's not like an A-B binary kind of selection, but it's clear to me that basically saying like this is no longer the way that we want to see things operate. So it's at these moments when we see cracks in the regime, and I'm using this particular language referencing, if some of you might use the multi-layer perspective as an analysis tool, but this is when niche innovations start to have opportunities to make broader scale changes. So, one observation is that capitalism is no longer only an economy of things. And this may be kind of an obvious statement, but what does it actually mean when the things don't go away, but the highest sort of centers of value creation and value capture have to do that basically can set the rules and set the pricing for the flow of information, or the vectors of information, have sort of the highest value capture in an economy largely fueled by information, data, and knowledge. Again, maybe not too surprising, but indicating that this is a transformation that design has also followed along with, which is that it is no longer primarily or only a discipline that is concerned about hand obvious, right? But at the same time, I would say that the question of the value theory of brands or the value theory of experiences is still highly underexplored, like what that would actually mean. And so, yes, SpongeBob is here as a stand-in for, there's a version of the book that's written entirely in memes, so if 350-page design theory book is too much, I want to make sure that students of mine can also enjoy the meme version of the book and maybe carry some of the big ideas. So I think the reason that this becomes a point of concern now, too, is that we've seen, over the last several decades in particular, this kind of massive diffusion of design practices into spaces that certainly in my lifetime would have been surprising to find designers having not only some active role, but even some maybe authoritative role inside practices related to social innovation, healthcare, design and governance, financial services, and this kind of thing. And so it is in this particular diffusion of design practices that I wonder if our paradigm, our logics of thinking about what design is and what kinds of values it can create have kept up with the kinds of practices that we're engaged in. I find that, just with this small list of sort of spaces in which design has diffused itself, that imperfect competition seems like it's sort of like a laughable ceiling of what the contribution is. So putting these ideas together, I mean, if take a kind of generic view of design as being something about the materializing of everyday life, and this term after capitalism referring to some kind of historical transition that seems to be underway or maybe struggling to emerge towards a different kind of economy and new kinds of social relations that go with it, I find this kind of interesting negotiation or sort of reciprocity happening between the emergence of a new kind of paradigm of design paired with the new kinds of practices. Not to say that one is leading the other, but that they are both sort of fueling each other, that different kinds of practices are pointing towards different kinds of paradigms, and different kinds of paradigmatic ideas are pointing towards new kinds of practices. And of course, it's already happening, but kinda. And this is where I very much like the famous quote by the sci-fi author William Gibson, who says, "The future is already here, but just unevenly distributed." I think that is the situation that design finds itself in today. So if Heskett's work says, okay, there's not a lot to find in existing mainstream economic theory for design, we have to make our own model. Looking somewhere else, I think, actually gives some different ideas. And so now I reference the work of J.K. Gibson Graham, kind of feminist economic geographers writing together the sort of feminist critique of the capitalist system. And they have this really wonderful schematic they call the tip of the iceberg. And so we talk about the economy a lot, and we can talk about what design's relationship is to the economy. And when we do that, we're typically speaking in a very narrow and focused view of what that might mean. And so the tip of the iceberg, as it were, according to J.K. Gibson Graham, is something like this: people working for wages, offering their labor to a firm to make products and services that will be sold, taking your wages to buy commodities. What J.K. Gibson Graham point our attention to, though, is that this is literally the tip of an iceberg in which so many other kinds of diverse economic practices are happening literally everywhere that you look, and that in fact even the tip of the iceberg is fully dependent on all of these alternative kinds of practices that are happening, even if it's below the waterline, as it were. So this sort of myth, or this capitalist-centric view that the economy is a singular kind of thing, is itself well, a myth, I suppose you could say. And so if nothing else, one of the things I've been trying to do is to bring attention to designers, design practices of various kinds, to ways in which design does not need to reinvent value creation in some way, but actually find and support the variety of diverse economic practices that are already happening below the waterline. I'm also leaning here a bit on the work of Donella Meadows. So you may know Donella Meadows' work as a kind of well-known systems theorist. And what Meadows has done over the years is create and refine what she considers a short list of leverage points. So in studying systems of various kinds, where are the moments where you might have the most impact? Where are the leverage points where you could intervene in a system to find the most dramatic shifts? I won't go through all 12 of them, but in increasing order of impact, the top two have to do very much with this notion of the paradigm. The mindset about how this system is structured, the mindset that people hold when they are operating inside this system, the kinds of goals, the rules, the parameters that arise within it, is the second highest level of, or the second highest point of potential impact. But the first is the power to actually transcend that paradigm, so that as the mindset transitions, practices transition, new feedback loops transition, the paradigm itself begins to shift. This is, I guess, in my own little humble way, what I am trying to do in some space of design, design research and design practice. And I think as an applied field, what that means is it has to carry across theory, practice, and education simultaneously. That one without the other two is going to not actually make any kind of paradigmatic transition, but that actually all three have to be hit upon. And this is, sort of no small order, but how I'm trying to go about this. So on the practice level, it's been fascinating and challenging to try to bring some of this alternative economic theory idea to diverse design practices. Of course, the challenge is that different kinds of design practices operate with different methods, different tools, different approaches, their own mindsets. But I've had some opportunities to bring some of the theoretical ideas in the form of tools and methods to, for example, UX designers working at Google. And so I'm pretty critical of Google in the book, I should say, and many of their economic practices and data extraction, those kinds of things. But also just to remember that Google is a transnational corporation that has something like 1,000 UX designers working at it. Those UX designers are also interested in the future and how design might participate in doing things differently. As much as I may be critical of Google as an organization, we can also look at staged walkouts by Google employees and these kinds of things. But in any event, in these opportunities, it's trying to think about how to divert some aspect or some attention from the designing process towards alternative economic structures. So in this case, it was working with UX designers to to imagine how, may I, hold on. Okay, can I minimize this? Okay. Okay. Uh-oh. Can you? Cool. Okay. Gracias. Okay. So, thinking about tools or methods that might help sort of divert attention from a search being something that would be deemed as having potentially commercial intent to be something that might actually elevate results that would focus on different kinds of transactions, different kinds of labor, or different kinds of enterprises happening within some kind of like local or community economy. Similarly, working in like a very different domain, of course we have an increasing number of service designers working in and around governments and governance of different scales. I was invited by a professional working group of service designers that work in government, invited by one of the people who runs this group who works for NASA. Similar kinds of issues. I mean, design practices that are coming out of a certain kind of paradigm that imagines users as individually focused autonomous agents, imagines users sometimes as customers. What does that mean when you're actually thinking about social benefits or democratic participation or some of these other kinds of issues, placemaking within cities? And so similarly trying to bring tools and methods to service designers who are working either directly for or indirectly with federal agencies in the U.S. government. Very much in progress, so I'm trying to figure out if these tools can be in some way validated and made more useful across these diverse contexts. Of course, education, a big part of what I do, but I'm also myself a PhD researcher, PhD student right now, so I had this wonderful experience just a couple of months ago. I was doing similar kind of book talk in Italy and met with a dozen or so PhD researchers from IUAV in Venice, and I was just, sort of heartened, but it was amazing to see how much the topics of research of these PhD researchers resonated with basically everything I've been talking about, and in particular some of the major themes of the book. And so it was a really fascinating discussion, whether we're talking about versions of the circular economy that are acknowledging that material circularity itself is sort of like a technological change that doesn't, if it doesn't come with a social change, is really not making sort of anything progressive happen. Acknowledging that, of all places, Italy is a place that in which I think social innovation is sort of at some kind of mature stage of practice. And so what does that mean? Like, what is the next stage, or sort of the mature stage of social innovation? What does that look like? But even, I think, more generally, this notion that I was able to observe sort of 12 for 12 of the dissertation proposals, a kind of mindset and posture shift of the paradigm of design and what kinds of new practices that that research might inform. I find myself also in a new kind of formal education situation in my role as a professor of urban technology. This is a new and I believe first of its kind undergraduate program in the United States at the University of Michigan. And I think the general argument here has to do with the fact that cities are, in fact, not only planned top-down, like eye of God model that Norman Bel Geddes and most urban planners have seen, but have to do with the ways that activist groups, community organizations, entrepreneurs of various kinds are leveraging design and technology to affect, impact, and shape the nature of cities. And we don't have a lot of formalized ways to teach that or to make a formal education that might lead to various kinds of practitioners in this space. To think about making civic technologies that in order to make cities more sustainable, more equitable, more accessible. And I think the point here is that I am certain that the individual focused and sort of, the design and technology methods that I might teach are not going to be good enough. And I don't have a whole toolkit of what the next paradigm of methods are that are appropriate for these practices, but we can start by acknowledging that these are the ones that I can share with you. These are not going to be good enough. Let's criticize them as we go, and hopefully you all are going to develop into the practitioners that will continue to make new methods and new tools in order to do this work better towards its goals. And so coming back to one of the big questions that set me off on this path and that I asked at the beginning of this presentation, what kinds of designing can shift the kind of paradigm that I'm describing or lead to a paradigmatic shift. I'm also grateful for Johan Redstrom's work on this. Maybe some of you know his Making Design Theory. One thing that I take away with and hold on to from Redstrom's work has to do with this notion that all of design operates in some tension between the very, very general and the very, very specific. So on the one end, we have a paradigm, like what designing is, some general notion of how it operates, what it's for, that kind of thing. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have some very particular things, like a particular outcome of a designing process, a particular product. And we have different scaled things happening in the middle, like practices, but practices tend to operate under a paradigm, a general understanding of what designing is and what it's for. Projects may yield multiple products, but they're also typically attached to a practice, which is sitting underneath a paradigm. Okay, so what? Interesting, but what do we do with that? Well, what I think is useful for me is that Redstrom pinpoints this middle space called the program, or that he deems the program, as a space that has the opportunity to make both upstream and downstream effects. So a program certainly can elicit and yield projects and products that will be defined by however the program is defined. But what Redstrom says is that we may actually redefine what design in general is through the making of new and different designs. And so not only do the products or sort of the projects become framed by the program, defined not only by words and ideas, but by actual experiments and prototypes, but that it actually has an upstream effect or can have an upstream effect. He goes on to say that we can use programs to state worldviews that we want to explore as if they were true, so as to learn something about what kind of design they would lead to. And I find this to be very exciting, very provocative. It's not the work I think that UX designers at Google can do in their day jobs. It's not necessarily the work that service designers in the federal government can do day to day. It is work that design researchers, design practitioners who are attached with research labs or working in community engaged kind of work can do. And I think it is, for me, sort of like a massive invitation to consider how the programmatic level might shift the paradigm. I'm trying it out. This is part of my own PhD dissertation work in the throes of something maybe similar to what Luis was describing earlier about a practice-based and a participatory action research. And what I'm trying to accomplish here is to both initiate a kind of practice and study a kind of practice that has to do with distributing knowledge about DIY practices for building what I'm calling ecological technologies. And so it's taking multiple forms, but the primary form has to do with these half-day public workshops. It's been fascinating how much intergenerational participation happens. Of course, just because of me initiating, we have a lot of university design students, but we've had so many retired people show up, and actually these kinds of intergenerational connections that are happening are just kind of magical. And the way that it fits into the particular thread of design in which I'm pursuing this PhD is that it connects into this very oversimplified view of what transition design is all about. So Carnegie Mellon University's PhD is in transition design, and what transition design proposes is to imagine and to develop I would say not methods, but working approaches towards socio-technical systems level change. And this grossly oversimplified diagram is trying to say that in one way to go about that is the crafting, not of forecasting, but the crafting of future visions, and basically backcasting and creating transition pathways that acknowledge that this is not the scale of a project, but this is the scale of an ecology of interventions. Many, many, many different kinds of practices, many, many different kinds of interventions. Requires radical transdisciplinarity because the kinds of professional design practices that I might be familiar with might only be relevant to a very small few of those interventions. Some of them may be more policy oriented, some of them may be more entrepreneurial, and so on. But this basic formula is what I'm trying to capture with the Solar Punk Design Academy. I find it super fascinating as somebody having grown up in a similar time frame as the solar punk thing has emerged, that in the midst of so many crises, that this what started as a kind of sci-fi genre has become its own aesthetic movement that is saying, like, enough dystopia, right? Like we need positive visions of the world to come. And I think the question that I'm trying to ask is, can we sort of tap into that cultural imaginary? Can we tap into that youthful optimism in some ways and attach it to a kind of design? What kind of design would solar punk design be? What would it look like and what would it do? And so one answer I think to this question is by giving this kind of cultural frame, the way that design makes things understood, knowable, but also desirable and like cool and exciting, interesting alternatives to other possibilities, to bring existing knowledge about things like getting a community together to build a small-scale wind turbine or building biochar in your backyard, so that in some ways design becomes kind of the glue to pull all of these different maybe seemingly fringe activities off of the fringe and into some kind of everyday activities and practices. And so the design questions have a lot with like how to, but also how to motivate in some ways. So it takes a lot of different forms. We've done some kind of like focused empirical studies on DIY instructions and how and when are they usable, but also how and when does usability become something that is a motivator to actually do something like this. It also takes the form of these various public workshops that I've talked about. If we're making a small-scale stove in order to make biochar, it also makes heat, so it's a nice opportunity for people to get together, cook a meal, create biochar, understand that you have just actively participated in a carbon sequestration process. It's like alchemy. You've just captured carbon in that process. And then we can also talk about this new kind of materiality. What can we do with biochar as designers or as retired people or people with small-scale farms going on in their yards? Talking about hydroponic systems, again, existing knowledge about simple techniques for building these kinds of things. But what happens when we start to, implement this in kind of a community way? One of the terms I've been holding on to is this one, infrastructures as resistance. I pulled these words out of one of the many solar punk manifestos. It was talking about infrastructural crises in places like Detroit and Flint, Michigan, close to home. And I thought, yes, that is what, that is one of the sort of operating models of this kind of design that I think is fascinating. It's not about these artifacts. It is about the fact that you're creating an infrastructure for a new kind of productive system, whether that's for making biochar, growing food in your cold Midwestern apartment through the hydroponic system. But I think maybe the most important infrastructure that we're building is this community of practice for sharing the knowledge, improving upon the instructions, showing what happens after we've harvested our herbs or whatever it is, and beginning to circulate those in new ways. Now, of course, the side research folds into formal education. For some reason, the University of Michigan let me teach a seminar in the Masters of Architecture program. I'm not an architect at all, so it's a really fascinating opportunity to think about bringing some of these tools, some of these methods developed out of alternative economic theory, tested out in some practitioner workshops into the fold of an educational experience. And, having students in architecture think, I'd say, pretty broadly about what a design practice might look like that isn't just about producing things, but about producing systems and producing instructions, public-facing events, facilitating the making of these kinds of things. So students who are working on making various forms of guerrilla gardening. So I think that the term here is seed bombs, although we're thinking of maybe become a less aggressive term than seed bombs, but the idea of a kind of a map of the city that allows people to, in a distributive kind of way, plant the pollinator gardens, the rain gardens that help with mitigation of flooding on highly paved surfaces and this kind of thing. An interest in biomaterials, but trying to get biomaterials out of the lab and just into the hands of practice. So we spent an afternoon making corncrete, which is some combination of cornstarch and sand, and finding out some ways that very immediately we could start to make small scale but functional artifacts out of these biomaterials. And I think there's something so important about that tangibility, so that we have now architecture students who are thinking about biomaterials but can't quite go build the building, but actually now have a direct material reference point from handling these materials. And another student who was fascinated by the work of Enzo Mari, much like myself, who was working in the 1970s in Italy and imagining DIY practices that the designer can make the instructions for the entire suite of furniture that one might make themselves, and perhaps the greatest the greatest gift there is that you become, the maker of your own household goods, your own furniture. And Sophie's taking a kind of feminist approach that she calls femzomari, so looking at domestic practices in terms of like home salons, home beauty care practices that sometimes happen in garages in the American Midwest, and imagining that the women operating these practices might also like build their own spaces and build their own furniture. And we came to find out that several of her classmates had never operated a power drill. So we took the opportunity of what was a seminar class to say, okay, let's build your instructions for this home vanity right here on the conference room table, as it were. So trying to bring things back around towards a conclusion and in some way try to connect to what I understood might be some of the big topics at this conference, I was thinking a little bit about my experiences studying with this guy, Peter Bishop. He was now retired, but for a long time a professor in the Strategic Foresight program at the University of Houston. And what I studied with him was just really kind of in awe in his way of, articulating the value of futures thinking and this kind of thing. But what Peter said is that from a very early age, we are taught to break apart problems, to fragment the world. This apparently makes complex tasks and subjects more manageable, but we pay a hidden, enormous price. We can no longer see the consequences of our actions. We lose our intrinsic sense of connection to a larger whole. And of course, the separating, the distinction, the cutting is required for, I think, deep analysis of what's happening. But if we don't do the reassembly to see these bigger wholes, I think we start to lose this kind of connection, this sense. And in some way, I think this is part of what the capitalist paradigm has done when it has instrumentalized design to a sort of narrow focus of metrics that start to dissociate from the whole. So as I looked at sort of the topics of conversation here, I was thinking about these many key words: complexity, climate, culture and diversity, technology, and futures. And I would like to just maybe throw in there thinking about one lens for thinking about the larger whole, which is in some way political economy, which is maybe a big, expensive academic word, but has to do with the way that we can, and I think maybe should, as designers, consider how it is that we are intervening in different kinds of power relations. How do we use our authority or our power relations inside that space? How do we have authority or not in the allocation of resources, and how do we articulate the making of value or perhaps new kinds of value in the work that we do? And after speaking this long about design in the future, it's also good just to remember this, that the future actually doesn't exist. And maybe this is like the biggest invitation of all, which is it is being made right now. Thank you very much.